Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, the Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we will talk to experts about a variety of topics and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Hello and welcome. We're taking a break from our recent onslaught of Ukraine podcast to talk a little bit about what's happening inside the United States. And particularly today, I wanted to talk about the release of the Biden administration's fiscal year 2023 budget, and specifically talking about the Air Force side of things because of the Air Force-minded nature of this podcast. And so to do that, today I'm talking with the Air Force and Pentagon reporter at Breaking Defense, Valerie Insinna, about what's going on, about the budget request, and what we think will happen or may happen as the budget gets debated in Congress. So Valerie, welcome back on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I know that you've had a busy week going to various hearings to cover this topic. So perhaps you could just share with us, your top line thoughts on the fiscal 2023 budget, what it says, what it doesn't, and what you're hearing in all of your reporting.
So, top line for the DoD budget this year is $773 billion. It's the biggest budget the Pentagon has ever had. But what's missing is a lot of the details. This year, the Pentagon did not release any of the J books, the justification books that typically lay out kind of program by program where the money is being spent, what sort of spending they're projecting over the next 5 years in different areas. So we got none of that detail. The reason why they said is because just a couple weeks ago, Congress passed their omnibus spending bill for FY2022. And so the reasoning was we didn't have enough time to put the enacted numbers into all of the budget documentation that we've been creating over the past 6 months or so. So we all have to kind of wait until the middle of April to kind of see what this budget really, really looks like. In terms of overall funding, it looks like kind of across the board, with DoD and all of the services, a lot of the money, the biggest growth that we're seeing is in research and development, which makes sense in the sense of, the department is looking at China and trying to figure out what sort of investments it needs to make in order to counter it in the future. At the same time, that the department delivered its budget to Capitol Hill on Monday, it also sat down lawmakers and gave them a classified briefing on the national defense strategy, the new national defense strategy. And that's something that, again, the unclassified version of that hasn't come out. So, us reporters and think tank folks and lay people that don't have security clearances, we just get to wait another month or so until we get to see what little detail that they put out on that. But sort of the big story there is, at least, from what we've seen, it's very similar to 2018 in that China is the pacing threat. They are using some language now to describe Russia as an acute threat, probably due to Ukraine. But it seems like there's a lot of continuity happening. So even though this was kind of a whirlwind week in terms of, budget is out, new defense strategy is out, it's like kind of everything is out with an asterisk.
Right. And I think some of maybe the concern, or at least the chatter that I'm seeing, and this applies, at least in my world, to both the Navy and the Air Force, is that in certain ways, while the plus up is coming from research and development, is that some of the ways that the services are looking to save money is by divesting themselves from legacy systems with the promise to invest in future buys, i.e. that both the Air Force and the Navy will get smaller. And this causes a lot of angst, let's say, amongst partisans from each branch. Could you talk about that a little bit, about the sort of, what is it, divest to reinvest slogan that I'm seeing floating around Twitter?
Yeah, it's something that the Air Force has tried to do over the past gosh, I mean, more than 5 years now, probably closer to a full decade, with varying levels of success. This year, we saw quite a lot of that from the Navy as well. I believe it was something like 24 ships that it wants to decommission in FY23 while only adding 9. So that has a lot of people on the Hill kind of wondering, okay, where is all of this money going? And is it right for us to decommission ships, send a bunch of aircraft to the boneyard, if we don't have replacements for them? For the Air Force, they are planning on sending more than 200 aircraft to the boneyard again. Last year they did about the same number. This year it's, a little bit beyond that. And it's, that's something that, they're going to have to go up in front of Congress and make that argument for why this needs to happen. I think, not to get too much into current operations, but I think that one of the big arguments that they might run into, both the Navy and the Air Force, is, with everything that's happening in Eastern Europe, with, the war happening in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, a lot of these assets are out there being used and providing information and providing deterrence. So can the services sort of thread the needle and make that argument of, look, we need to divest these platforms that we're using every day, but we swear we need to do this, or else, we're going to be completely hamstringed in the future?
There's two aspects. Is that, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the other places where there are investments going is on munitions, increasing the magazine, I guess the number of munitions and magazines, and I think that's something that's been needed, especially with all the calls about Russia perhaps running low on cruise missiles, and not a lot of thinking about how the U.S. could run into similar situations, particularly in a large peer conflict. And I think the one more closer to your heart is the cut and buy of the number of F-35s, a program that has obviously been in trouble, or at least had troubles because of cost overruns, but many thought had gotten back on track. So I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts on both the increase in munition buys and perhaps the cut in F-35 buys.
Yeah, I think the increase in munition buys is definitely something to keep an eye on. About a week or so ago, Bill LaPlante, who is set to become the Pentagon acquisition czar, he testified in front of Congress for his nomination hearing and was asked by one senator who wanted to know, a year from now, what do you want to point to as something that you've changed? And LaPlante said directly, I want to scale up munitions production and drone production. So I think what we're seeing now, especially as all of these, munitions, missiles, ammo go to Ukraine, this sort of thinking about, okay, what do we need to do to replenish our stocks? What do we need to do to make sure that we have enough weapons, both now and in the future? And then what's the sort of next generation look like? And are we doing our investments wisely there? On F-35, that's like another really interesting story. So you've basically got the Air Force cutting their buy pretty drastically, going from about 48 F-35s a year down to 33, and choosing to invest more in F-15EX, raising that buy from 12 to 24. And sort of the backstory, from what I've understood, is kind of interesting. When the Air Force Secretary, Frank Kendall, came into office, he wanted a very hard look done at the budget. And what I've heard from multiple people is that he directed the Air Force to potentially look at canceling F-15EX. What would it be like if we were to cancel it? And basically, advocates within the Air Force and within OSD came back and said, no, this isn't a good idea. The Air Force has sort of pivoted to, okay, if we're going to have to buy F-15EX, let's buy them as quickly as possible so that we can replace our old F-15s that are falling apart. And that's wait on buying F-35 until, in these bigger numbers, until the Block 4 F-35s come on board. And those are going to be, just have a much more powerful computing system, have much more capability. So I think the thinking is, these Block 4 F-35s are what we want. So that's not buy now and then pay to upgrade them. That's just wait, a couple of years, and then we can get back into buying these in larger quantities.
The criticisms of this write themselves, right? Like, you can understand if that's truly the case, right? Is that the F-15EX is, like, I think of the two, supposed to be the more, even though the F-35 has been around, correct me if I'm wrong, the more mature, because it is essentially built off of the latest F-15 version that was sent to Qatar, right? With some tweaks for the U.S. Air Force. Whereas the F-35 is an iterative program. And Block 4 is the standard that the U.S. Air Force wants moving forward in the future. But I'm not sure where we are in the blocks. You can tell me. But the criticism of this is obvious. It's that if China is the pacing threat, are we keeping pace by divesting to reinvest? And shouldn't we just buy as much as we can, as fast as we can, and worry about the upgrades, like from Block 3, I believe, to Block 4, like we did with the original F-15 buy in the 1980s?
Yeah.
What do you say about that?
I mean, I think that, if the Air Force had unlimited money, they would love to buy way more F-15EXs and F-35s. They're sort of being constrained by the fiscal realities, even though, the department has more money than ever. The Air Force still has to do a significant amount of investment in a lot of next generation technologies. They're putting more money this year into next generation air dominance, which is sort of their 6th generation fighter that is going to be accompanied by a bunch of drones, potentially. That's something that Frank Kendall is really into, figuring out, okay, so how do we use unmanned technologies to really augment our manned or crewed systems. And then, the Air Force also have 2 big nuclear programs that they're purchasing right now. So they've got the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, which is, a replacement for the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles. And then they've also got the B-21 bomber, which has money in procurement for the first time ever. And no one will talk about how many units they're buying this year. So that's kind of a fun little mystery. But I think they're sort of, that's a hard problem for them, that they would love to have more money just to be able to throw at the F-35 program or to throw at the F-15 program. But, reality kind of kicks in.
Yeah, no, I mean, as somebody who likes this stuff, I advocate for more money, but people don't really listen to me. And don't tell that to the Navy Twitter, because if you tell that to Navy Twitter, they're all over you. That is a very sort of passionate fan base on the internet.
Navy Twitter is spicy. They have a lot of opinions,
and they're very willing to share them loudly. Let me close out here, perhaps with like a final question, then we can wrap up.
Sure.
Is, you brought up the B-21. I was listening to a webinar, I don't know if you were on it too, with Steve Trimble and his colleagues from Aviation Week, and they had some thoughts on the B-21 in terms of the rate buy. I think they had slotted with the dollar amounts appropriated at 1 for this year. Can you just talk the listeners through where that program is and where do you think it's going?
Yeah, I mean, so honestly, anything that Steve Trimble and the folks at Aviation Week say in terms of the number crunching on B-21 that they've done is probably, like, I would trust it. They do great work over there. What we do sort of know about B-21 at this point is pretty little. They've got 6 on the line. The first one is moving through ground testing. There are rumors that there might be a rollout sometime this year where we might be able to take a little peek at it. But besides that, there just hasn't been a lot of news on the B-21. Even, like I said, even the numbers that we've gotten in the budget this year don't actually, the department won't actually tell us how many that they're buying this year. So they're keeping things very, very close to the chest.
All right, last question. I promise, and I'll let you go.
Sure.
This is sort of like a recommendation to Congress. And I think we're seeing reporting today is that, whatever it is that was included in the budget, like you can add a couple billion onto in terms of wish list goodies. And Congress, particularly on F-35, but also in like the A-10, has its own thoughts on the amount that should be bought and how long they should remain in service. Where do you think this will ultimately end up, given the congressional role coming in? Not asking for concrete predictions, but where do you think it'll go?
I would not be surprised if we saw the defense budget get plussed up, just for one, because of everything that's happening in Europe and the demands that are currently going on in terms of additional deployments, operations, equipment to Ukraine. But I also think that seeing everything that's going on over there, that'll make lawmakers maybe more willing to do more investment this year. I would not be surprised if we saw the amount of F-35s get increased, maybe back to last year's levels. I think that, maybe, so last year, on the F-35, lawmakers were pretty critical of the program, and now with the buy being much lower, I think maybe we'll see a little bit of a about face there as lawmakers, kind of try to do what they think they need to do to support the program. And in terms of divestments, I think, I think the Air Force might be a little bit more successful than the Navy, just because lawmakers have really come out and decried the decommissionings that are being proposed. The Air Force was actually pretty successful last year in getting Congress on board with the aircraft that it wanted to divest, with the exception of the A-10. But this year, the Air Force only asked for 21 A-10s to be divested. So maybe they'll actually get one or two, or maybe they'll get some actually retired this year.
Or they can send them to Ukraine. They can live out their golden years.
Oh gosh, please don't give anyone any ideas.
That was a joke for the podcast. With that, Valerie, any last thoughts before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I think the thing that I would say is that, whenever the department puts out a budget, it's sort of like, the starting whistle is being blown. And we've got many, many months of debate and deliberation. Who knows what's going to happen, around the world that is going to change things. So, this is a really interesting kind of starting point to find ourselves at. And I'm sure over the next couple of months, it's just going to get even more interesting, and we'll have to just see how it changes.
It's an invitation to come back on the podcast for, as I always call it, the niche esoteric half hour on the budget, which you're not really a true DC nerd until you eagerly await budget week, even though it's terrible.
Well, I don't mind being called esoteric. I think most people would agree with that.
People listen to this podcast, tune into the esoteric and niche. That's our sweet spot. Maybe I'll change the name. So with that, Valerie, thanks for coming on. Thanks for spending your lunch break with me, and thanks everybody for listening.
Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more from the Foreign Policy Research Institute's research, podcasts, and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.